Hi, my name is Mackenzie Heffernon, and for my initials research presentation, I'm going to be presenting my final project from Spanish 768, Hispanic Film and Cinema, titled The Voice of Communal Feminism, an investigation of the roles of Indigenous women in Latin American cinema. So to summarize my thesis, I propose to illustrate how Indigenous women created a new type of feminine role in film. To illustrate this, I focused on the communal women portrayed in the film Coraje del Pueblo by Jorge Sanjínes, and the personal testimony of Domitila Barrios titled Si me permiten hablar. My objective was to exhibit how cinema has converted into a medium to tell the stories and testimonies of Indigenous communities, while also highlighting how the presence of Indigenous women in cinema created a strong sense of communal feminism. So to start out with the two main sources that I focused on for my research paper, the film El Coraje del Pueblo premiered in 1971, and it illustrates a recreation of the government massacre of the mining community in Bolivia during the 20th century. This film is really a cool, unique mix between a documentary and a recreation because the characters were portrayed by real survivors and people from the Bolivian mining communities. And so with this, the Indigenous actors were seen as equal parts in the filming process, and they were involved in the creation of dialogue and narrative to help reflect their own stories and trials, which in turn created space for their own personal testimonies to be told. The personal testimony of Domitila Barrios, Si me permiten hablar, is just a powerful testimony of her life in the mines and in her village, in her activism for social and communal reform. And so there's a picture of her featured on the left in the center picture of her kind of in her element of activism, and she was also involved in the filming of El Coraje del Pueblo as well. So a little bit more on this concept of communal feminism, which is a very big part of my final project. These frequent themes of communal feminism are observed through the film El Coraje del Pueblo and Domitila's testimony, which we can see through the acts of these communal women from these Indigenous communities placing themselves in the front lines of demanding social reform. So the way in which Domitila combines government politics with her own personal social memory and experiences, along with the other women present in the film, really illustrates the strength and persistence of activism that is really just a large part of the Indigenous female identity, especially for the women in these Bolivian mining communities. So another source that I wanted to highlight as well that I used in my paper is the movie Roma by Alfonso Cuarón that came out in 2018 that follows the life of an Indigenous woman, Cleo, who's a domestic worker for a family in Mexico during the 70s. And while Cleo, who is played by an Indigenous woman, Yalitza Aparicio, she's a domestic worker, but the intent of Cuarón was to have the film represent the life of a domestic worker as a protagonist, you know, as a main core essential in the film. And this is another brilliant and poetic portrayal of a communal woman at the forefront of cinema and being able to tell a story that for so long was lost in the background in place of a secondary role. So finally, just some important focal points to take away. We see through these sources the transformation of cinema to include Indigenous communities and women as protagonists in film. We also see the importance of personal testimonies like Domitila's, especially for Indigenous women and their representations in film. And so the inclusion of these testimonies in general in film allows space for reflection and reaction from the audience. Then lastly, the new woman that is portrayed, or the new woman that is portrayed in Latin American cinema really represents the Indigenous communal woman as a protagonist and illustrates, again, the strength and resilience of the Indigenous female identity. And lastly, here are just some additional sources that were used through my paper, the films as well as articles that I used as well. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope you were able to learn a little bit more about the representation of Indigenous women in Latin American cinema and a little bit more about these films that I mentioned. Thank you.